It was the fall of 1998, inside the Atlanta Civic Center, a crisp October night, where the air carried the scent of autumn leaves and the buzz of thousands gathered for Stevie Wonder's charity concert. The stage was washed in warm amber light, the band easing into a soft groove as Stevie prepared to speak about the organizations the evening would support: schools for the blind, youth music programs, and shelters that brought dignity back to forgotten lives. But just as he reached for the microphone stand, he paused, tilting his head in that unmistakable way that meant something had caught his attention. The audience quieted instantly, sensing the shift. Stevie lifted his chin slightly, focusing on a cluster of seats reserved for a local school for the visually impaired. Rows of teenagers sat there, listening more intensely than anyone else in the room, swaying gently to the rhythm, tracing the vibrations of the speakers with their fingertips. Among them sat Marcus Lane, a 16-year-old student with a quiet posture and an old soul. He wore a button-down shirt he had ironed himself that afternoon, smoothing the fabric again and again until it felt perfect beneath his hands. Marcus loved music with a depth that words couldn't hold. He could identify chords by feeling the heat of a speaker, distinguish instruments by the way they vibrated through the floor, sense the emotion in a singer's voice like braille written in sound. Stevie had been his hero since childhood, the first musician who made Marcus believe blindness wasn't a limitation but another way of seeing the world. As the opening chords washed through the room, Marcus mouthed every word under his breath, unaware that Stevie Wonder was turning toward him, smiling softly, sensing a spirit that seemed to glow from the inside out. Without warning, Stevie raised a hand and said into the microphone, "My brother in the third row, the one singing every note like he wrote it, come up here with me." Gasps rippled through the Civic Center as heads turned toward the school section. Marcus froze. His teacher squeezed his arm. "Marcus, he means you," she whispered, her voice cracking with disbelief. Marcus shook his head instinctively, panic tightening his throat. He had never stood on a stage in his life. He didn't know where the steps were, how far the mic was, how to move without feeling for the next anchor, but Stevie extended his hand toward the darkness, his voice soft and steady. "Come on, Marcus, let's share this moment." And just like that, a blind teenager with trembling hands rose from his seat, stepping into a spotlight he couldn't see, but one that the whole world would soon feel. Marcus stood slowly, gripping the armrest of his seat as the world around him swelled into a blur of unfamiliar noise. Gasps, whispers, feet shuffling, the soft hum of anticipation rippling through thousands of people. His heart pounded high in his chest, each beat shaking him from the inside out. His teacher guided his hand to her shoulder, whispering, "I'm right here, one step at a time." The aisle felt impossibly long, the stage impossibly far away. Marcus kept his free hand hovering out in front of him, fingers searching for anything that could ground him, but instead of fear swallowing him entirely, there was something else, a warmth spreading through the audience, an unspoken encouragement that he could feel like heat brushing across his skin. People weren't watching him with judgment. They were holding their breath for him, believing in him. That alone pushed his trembling legs forward. As Marcus approached the front row, the lights grew hotter, pulsing through the air in a way he could feel deep in his bones. Stevie sensed him before he heard him. With a gentle smile, Stevie stepped away from the keyboard and walked toward the edge of the stage, extending his hand downward. An usher guided Marcus's fingers towards Stevie's palm. The moment their hands touched, Marcus exhaled sharply, an involuntary release of fear he had been holding for years. Stevie's grip was warm, steady, and full of a calm strength that wrapped around Marcus like a protective shield. "I've got you," Stevie said softly, his voice close enough that Marcus could feel the breath of each word. Then, with slow, careful steps, Stevie guided him up the stage stairs, one hand on Marcus's back, the other keeping their connection firm and reassuring. When Marcus reached the top, the roar of the crowd hit him like a wave. He couldn't see their faces, but he could feel them. Thousands of bodies leaning forward, thousands of hearts beating in his direction, thousands of hands applauding just for him. The floor beneath his feet vibrated with the force of it, a sensation so overwhelming he almost stepped back. Stevie sensed the hesitation and gently squeezed Marcus's shoulder. "Welcome, brother." brother," he said, with a soft chuckle. "You've got a whole room standing with you." The applause softened into a hush as Stevie placed the microphone in Marcus's hand. Marcus felt its weight, cool, smooth, powerful, something he had only ever imagined holding. The room went still. Completely still. Marcus stood in the center of the stage, blind to the faces before him, but suddenly aware of the spotlight's warmth, the microphone's hum, and the gravity of a moment he never dreamed would belong to him. Marcus held the microphone with both hands, his grip tight, his breath trembling as he tried to steady himself. The warmth of the spotlight pressed against his skin, outlining his small frame in a glow he could not see, but could feel in every inch of his body. The silence in the Civic Center felt enormous, stretching out before him like an ocean without edges. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, his lips parting as if to speak, but no sound came out. His mind raced. What if my voice cracks? What if I get lost? What if I disappoint him? Stevie stepped a little closer, placing one hand lightly on Marcus's back, grounding him with a gentle pressure. The simple touch steadied Marcus's breathing, spreading calm through his trembling chest. Stevie leaned closer and whispered just loud enough for Marcus to hear, "You don't need to see them, brother. Just feel the music. Let it lead you." Marcus closed his eyes, not because he needed to, but because it helped him focus on the rhythm humming through the floorboards. He could hear the faint buzzing of the speakers, the soft rustling of clothes in the audience, the distant hum of a fluorescent light above the stage, and beneath all of it, woven through the quiet like a pulse, was the heartbeat of the band waiting behind him. He lifted his chin an inch, inhaled deeply, and let the air settle into his lungs. When he finally opened his mouth to release a note, the first sound that escaped was barely a whisper, a fragile, breathy tone that floated only a few feet before dissolving into the darkness. But it was real. It was his. A soft murmur of encouragement rippled through the crowd, gentle and warm, giving Marcus the courage to try again. He adjusted his grip on the mic, exhaled slowly, and reached for the next note. What emerged this time wasn't tentative. It wasn't scattered or weak. It was a tone so rich, so shockingly soulful, that the entire audience gasped in unison. Marcus's voice, deep for his age and textured like velvet stretched over steel, poured into the room with the emotional depth of someone who had lived 1,000 lives. It resonated through the rafters, bounced off the balcony, wrapped itself around every listener, and settled right into the heart. Stevie's eyes widened, a smile spreading across his face as he stepped back, not out of courtesy but out of respect. Marcus wasn't singing like a student. He wasn't singing like a shy teenager. He was singing like someone born from the very fabric of soul music itself. And as the final vibration of that first note lingered in the room, the audience understood they were witnessing something unreal, something no one would ever forget. The second note Marcus released climbed higher, carrying a warmth so powerful it washed through the room in a way no one expected. His voice had a fullness that didn't waver. It bloomed. It wrapped itself around the audience like a thick, glowing ribbon, each vibration landing heavy in their chests. A woman in the second row pressed her fingertips to her lips, eyes wide and shining. A man near the aisle whispered, "My God," as if witnessing something divine. Even the teenagers from Marcus's school, who had grown accustomed to his quiet singing in hallways and during free periods, sat frozen with disbelief. They had heard Marcus sing before, but never like this. Tonight, Marcus wasn't holding back. He wasn't afraid of being seen. Tonight, he was letting the room feel him, every ounce of him. Behind him, the band watched in stunned silence. The drummer held his stick still against his leg. The bass player leaned forward, mouth slightly open. The keyboardist blinked rapidly, whispering, "This kid," under his breath. Marcus sang another line, smooth, soul-drenched, bursting with emotion that seemed far too huge for a boy of 16. His voice cracked once, but the crack wasn't a flaw. It was a fracture of truth, a point where the whole room felt his vulnerability spill through. That moment sent a ripple through the crowd so intense that people audibly reacted. Some clutched their chests, others wiped tears that had started slipping silently down their cheeks. Marcus couldn't see their faces, but he could feel the air shift. He could feel the way the room leaned toward him, how the silence behind his notes was not emptiness, but reverence. Stevie stepped back even farther now, placing both hands on his heart as Marcus's voice filled the stage without hesitation. He had invited the teen to share a moment with him, but what was happening was something else entirely. This wasn't a moment being shared. This was a moment Marcus was owning. Stevie lifted his face toward the audience and shook his head slowly, as if overwhelmed by the miracle unfolding beside him. When Marcus reached the end of the phrase, the note he finished on was so resonant, so hauntingly beautiful, that the entire room erupted, not in applause, but in a thunderous chorus of gasps, sobs, and the whisper of thousands of stunned breaths. For a few seconds, no one moved. No one dared. Marcus Lane, a teenager who had never stood on a stage, who navigated life through sound and instinct, had just shifted the axis of the entire room, and he was only getting started. Marcus inhaled again, and this time he didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, just half a step, barely noticeable, but the entire audience felt it like a shift in gravity. His voice slid into the next line with a richness that felt ancient, as though he were channeling decades of soul singers before him. Each note pulsed through the Civic Center with the emotional weight of someone who understood music not as sound, but as a way of surviving. People in the balcony gripped the railings, stunned by the power coming from a boy who stood before them with such humility, such quiet presence. Marcus didn't perform like someone trying to impress. He performed like someone finally being allowed to speak in his native language. His voice rose, warm and full, vibrating through the wooden stage and into the bones of everyone listening. It wasn't just singing, it was revelation. The pianist finally couldn't resist. With Stevie's subtle nod, he pressed a soft chord beneath Marcus's melody, gentle, supportive, letting the teen lead. The room shifted, the music deepened. Marcus tilted his head slightly, sensing the harmony through the floorboards, and then something extraordinary happened. He matched it perfectly. Without seeing the keys, without hesitating, he shifted the tone of his voice to blend with the piano, sculpting the sound in a way seasoned singers trained for years to achieve. The band collectively inhaled in disbelief. The bassist mouthed, "No way!" The drummer's eyes widened as he leaned forward instinctively, pulled by the gravity of Marcus's gift. The audience watched in stunned silence as the blind teen adjusted the dynamics of his voice with a precision only a handful of artists ever mastered. Stevie took another step back, hands raised as if surrendering the stage. As Marcus moved into the next line, his voice swelled into a soaring note so powerful, so heartbreakingly pure, that the entire room erupted mid-phrase. People couldn't help themselves. They screamed, they cried. Some stood from their seats without realizing it. A woman near the front dropped her purse, hands clasped to her face as tears streamed down. The note carried through the theater like a wave of heat, melting every barrier between performer and audience. Marcus's classmates in the reserved section were crying openly, calling his name, shaking their heads as if unable to understand how the quiet boy who hummed between classes had just transformed into a force of nature. Stevie turned slowly toward Marcus, awe covering his face. He whispered into the mic, This, young man, is the truth." The crowd exploded again, drowning the room in applause so fierce it vibrated through Marcus's feet like thunder. Marcus stood rooted to the center of the stage, his chest rising and falling in deep rhythmic breaths as the applause thundered around him. Though he couldn't see the crowd on their feet, he could feel them, feel the vibrations traveling up through the platform, feel the swell of voices surging through the air like a warm tidal wave crashing over him. His hands trembled around the microphone, but for the first time since stepping onto the stage, his trembling wasn't from fear, it was from realization. His voice had done this. He had done this. Stevie approached with slow, reverent steps, almost as if he were approaching a sacred moment rather than a teenage boy standing under a spotlight. "Marcus," Stevie murmured, his voice rich with emotion. "You hear the way they're calling your name?" Marcus lifted his chin, listening as The sound of thousands chanting his name washed over him like a storm of love he had never known before. Stevie gently placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, grounding him as the applause softened into a warm hum. "You got more in you?" Stevie asked with a smile audible in his voice. Marcus exhaled a shaky laugh, small, humble, overwhelmed. "Yes, sir," he whispered. The audience gasped in delight, the sound rising like a spark caught in kindling. Stevie motioned to the band, and this time the entire ensemble lifted their instruments with renewed purpose. The pianist played a gentle intro, a soft cascade of notes that flowed across the room like a stream. Marcus tilted his head toward the sound, orienting himself with precise instinct. The moment he felt the vibrations settle into the floor, he lifted the microphone again, and when he began to sing, it wasn't tentative, it wasn't cautious, it was confident, effortlessly, unmistakably confident. His voice blended with the piano like it had always belonged there, filling the theater with a soul so full and rich that some people in the audience simply closed their eyes and let themselves weep. The band joined in, slowly at first, then fully, completely, building a musical landscape around Marcus's voice. The horns swelled softly in the background, the bass rumbled with gentle depth, the drums tapped out a heartbeat that matched the pounding in every listener's chest. And Marcus soared above it all. He navigated every shift, every chord change, every dynamic rise with the precision of someone who wasn't guessing, but feeling. His voice wasn't just strong, it was intuitive, emotional, alive. As he reached the chorus, he lifted a note so powerful the room erupted mid-phrase again, people shouting and crying, as though witnessing a moment that was rewriting something inside them. Marcus didn't see them stand, didn't see them lift their hands in worship like awe, but he felt the energy, the way the room pulsed with human hearts beating as one. And as he held that final breathtaking note, Stevie stepped back once more, tears shining in his eyes. Marcus Lane, blind, soft-spoken, unnoticed by most of the world, was standing in a spotlight meant for legends, and he was filling it completely. As Marcus released the final note of the chorus, the room erupted into a sound so explosive it felt like the walls themselves were vibrating. People were no longer simply applauding. They were shouting his name, stomping their feet, reaching toward the stage as if trying to touch the miracle unfolding before them. Marcus could feel the tremor of the crowd, through the soles of his shoes, through the platform beneath him, through the air vibrating with raw emotion. His breath hitched, his throat tightening as a wave of disbelief washed over him. He had never heard so many voices calling for him, never felt so much love directed at him at once. This wasn't pity, it wasn't courtesy, it was awe. Pure, electric awe. Stevie stepped beside him, one hand placed gently on Marcus's shoulder, grounding him amid the storm. "Brother," Stevie said into the microphone, his voice thick with emotion, "you just shook this entire building." The crowd roared again, louder than before, a sound that rose like thunder crashing through the rafters. Marcus's classmates were on their feet, crying, cheering, clutching one another as their friend, quiet, gentle Marcus Lane, stood on stage commanding a room of thousands. One boy, his closest friend, cupped his hands around his mouth and screamed, "Go, Marcus! That's you, man! That's you!" A woman in the fourth row fell to her knees, overcome by the spiritual weight of the moment, and Stevie just stood there smiling, shaking his head in disbelief, wiping a tear from beneath his glasses. "You were made for this," he whispered to Marcus, though the microphone barely caught the words. Marcus swallowed hard, overwhelmed, his heart pounding so fiercely it felt like his ribcage might burst. Stevie lifted Marcus's hand into the air, turning toward the roaring audience. "Remember this name," Stevie announced, voice booming with pride. "Marcus Lane. He just changed the temperature of this room." The applause surged again, a tidal wave of emotion that poured over Marcus like sunlight breaking through clouds. He felt his knees weaken, not from fear, but from the sheer magnitude of what had just happened. Stevie sensed it instantly, sliding an arm around the teen's back to steady him as the cheers continued to grow. Marcus raised the microphone to his lips, voice trembling. "Thank you," he whispered. Two simple words, but the audience erupted again because they heard everything inside them: humility, gratitude, disbelief, hope. And as the band began a soft outro behind him, Marcus stood tall in a spotlight he couldn't see, but one he had undeniably earned. A blind teenager who had spent his life navigating the world through touch and sound, had just delivered a performance so unreal, so extraordinary, that it rewrote the night, and the world would never forget it. Long after the last note faded and the adrenaline eased into a warm afterglow, the Atlanta Civic Center still carried the echo of Marcus's voice as though it refused to let the moment die. The stagehands moved quietly, exchanging looks of disbelief as they coiled cables and packed equipment, each of them whispering the same name, Marcus. Members of the band lingered near their instruments, replaying the performance in their minds, shaking their heads with soft smiles that said they'd been changed by what they'd heard. Even the custodial staff paused in the aisles, standing silently as if the room itself was still vibrating with the memory. It wasn't the kind of night that faded. It was the kind of night that stayed imprinted on the walls, the seats, the air. A night where a teenager who had never seen the spotlight became the very definition of it. Outside, Marcus walked slowly beside his classmates, each of them guiding him gently, their hands brushing his arms, their voices a chorus of pride and amazement. The cool October air wrapped around him like a soft blanket, but his chest was still warm, still buzzing with the applause, the love, the thunder of thousands calling his name. He lifted his face toward the night sky, not seeing the stars, but feeling something just as bright inside his chest. For the first time in his life, Marcus didn't feel small. He didn't feel like a kid navigating a world built for sight. He felt powerful, capable, seen. His teacher wiped tears from her cheeks as she whispered, "Marcus, you changed lives tonight." He didn't respond right away. He needed a moment to breathe, a moment to let the truth settle into his bones. Back inside the empty theater, Stevie remained seated at the piano, his hands resting lightly on the keys. He wasn't playing, just absorbing the stillness, replaying the sound of Marcus's voice humming in the back of his mind. A slow smile spread across his face, full of pride and gratitude. "That boy," he murmured into the quiet, "he's got the kind of soul you only hear once in a generation." Stevie tapped a single note on the piano, soft, warm, hopeful, the same way he had done countless times when he sensed the birth of something extraordinary. Because this wasn't just a performance, it was a beginning, a moment where a blind teenager stepped onto a stage not knowing what waited for him, and walked off as something more, someone destined, someone unforgettable. And as the final echoes finally dissolved into silence, Stevie whispered what everyone in the Civic Center already knew: Marcus Lane is going to change the world.